Hi everyone, I'm Darshana. So in this video I thought of talking about something that has some relevance to the contemporary issues, especially this COVID issue, but something that is more, I guess, uh, that can be generalizable to testing the so-called alternative knowledge systems. Now in Sri Lanka particularly there has been a very lively debate on the efficacy of the traditional medicine or non non-Western medicine in treating COVID-19. Uh, I mean, the debate has been there for other chronic illnesses as well for a while, but I think with the advent of COVID-19 and the immense impact that it has had on the livelihoods and lives of the people and the economy, so there's an interest in finding potential therapeutics, right? So for some reason that interest seems to be a bit lacking with respect to modern medicine, pharmaceutical drugs, although in other countries I think uh, there are some research going on finding potential pharmaceutical drugs in modern medicine. But at least in the Sri Lankan context, there's a huge interest in traditional medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, the potential applications of those um, herbal formulas in treating COVID-19. So uh, uh, one of the proposed methods has been to test the efficacy of these um, of these herbal formulas, because this is a novel disease, right? So you don't have years of generations of trial and error kind of participative or crowd based experiments that were done on these herbal formulas, because what usually happens in traditional medicine or Ayurvedic medicine is that there are no clinical trials per se, but you basically learn through experience. So the root of these medical systems, usually there will be some spiritual element to it. I think even in Ayurveda, the Ayurvedic texts say that there was the founders of Ayurveda were like sages or hermits who meditated, and so that's how they got their original knowledge. But over time that body of knowledge may expand through different trials and experiences of the practitioners and as well as the patients, and that knowledge passes through generations, right? And it might get updated, but that rate of change, I guess, in that particular knowledge system is minimal, or it's very slow, the rate of change, compared to modern medicine. Because in modern medicine, I think if you look at the established knowledge, if in modern medicine now and 50 years back, most of the things may have changed, and in 50 years or 100 years of time, most of the things that we accept as established truths in modern medicine may not be considered correct, right? So for example, if we take something like when maybe a couple of decades back or even 1 decade back, people modern medicine used to say that saturated fats are not good for your heart, right? But now I guess that claim is not that established in modern medicine. That claim is changing now. Though now I think saturated fats are considered good. So that change of the established knowledge in modern medicine is very fast, right? One reason for that may be that it's entirely based on control experiments or some kind of statistical methods used to establish the most valid therapeutics uh, or the most valid knowledge in terms of food habits and so on. Whereas in traditional knowledge systems, that rate of change is very slow because the origin of that knowledge systems, I mean, that's what they would proclaim, that it would be some kind of a spiritual origin or a non kind of metaphysical origin, or not entirely a physical origin, right? But anyway, now then when we get a new disease, what we can do is, usually I think what happens is, so there will be some purported treatments or cures, and people would just try it out, right? The practitioners or the general public would try it out, and most of the time I mean, there could be drastic side effects, but most of the time it's based on, because it's based on herbs, most of the time most people will tolerate them, I think. But so generally people would try it out, and that would be a very disorganized kind of a crowdsourced experiment where people will identify whether something works or not over time, and it's not published in a journal or something like that. It's a very informal, very crowdsourced process. So there are pros and cons of that approach, I think. The advantage is you can't manipulate it easily, because it's basically self-organizing kind of knowledge. So you can't bribe someone, or you can't pressure someone, put some political pressure and manipulate it, because it's public knowledge, it's part of the culture. Whereas on the other hand, it might not be very systematic. I mean, the placebo effect may be there, and the dissemination of knowledge may not be that effective. So those pros and cons are there. Now on the other hand, there has been a lot of interest in testing for these herbal formulas, using, particularly because of the urgency with respect to COVID-19, with testing, because that accumulation of the cultural knowledge, that crowdsource experiment approach usually takes a lot of time, a considerable amount of time, and it's not very efficient in disseminating knowledge. And you can't be very definite about it, because it's most of it is anecdotal, right? So there has been a lot of interest in testing these herbal formulas using some kind of the modern biochemical test, right? The PCR test, or with respect to COVID-19, it could be the PCR test or antigen or antibody test or something like that. Now if we just take that particular approach, testing for them using the modern biochemistry or biochemical tests, so it's I think it's an interesting approach, because in one way it's kind of applying the utility of different knowledge systems to combining them to so you validate one knowledge system, the knowledge of one knowledge system, using the method. It's not the same method. I'll explain why it's not the same method, but using some kind of a method or knowledge in another knowledge system, right? So you combine them, and they are also, the idea is the justification for doing that is basically the utility, right? Because it's not, you are not trying to look at which is the more objective knowledge system, right? You just need to see what works, and maybe the herbal formula works in treating the patients. The modern biochemistry may work better in sort of objectively or efficiently evaluating whether someone has got better or not, right? So you just combine those two and kind of come up with a synergistic knowledge system. So Now, and one important distinction there with pharmaceutical drugs is because when you apply, say, double-blind control trials to test an herbal formula, versus when you apply double-blind control trial to to test a pharmaceutical drug, modern pharmaceutical drug, which is patented. In the pharmaceutical drug, usually I think you have to explain the mechanism. There is understanding and explanation of the mechanism, how it works, based on biochemistry, or some kind of explanation would be there. And that is usually, I think, that is considered very important to get for a particular treatment protocol to be accepted. Of course, I think there are some drugs even in modern medicine that are whose mechanism is not that explained. I mean, or people might not be exactly sure how they work, but they do work. But I think majority of the pharmaceutical drugs, there is some explanation, right? Some explanation based on the existing knowledge on how they work, and there is an active ingredient that enables you to do that. But the problem with herbal formulas is that, I mean, if you take just one ingredient, if you take pea honey, for instance, it itself is very, itself may have hundreds of active bioactive components, and when you combine multiple or sometimes dozens of such ingredients, you get a synergistic effect. So you might not be able to reduce it to one active ingredient, and the actual mechanism may be too complex. I mean, we might not even know how they work, right, synergistically. So I think that makes it very difficult for us to explain the mechanism. But all we can do is basically test whether something works or not. So you can, maybe with respect to COVID, now there is some argument whether PCR test is rampant with false positives, which I think it is. But we will just, if we consider that PCR test is the accepted method of testing for COVID, so maybe we can give the herbal formula, and after a few days we can test with the PCR test, and we can test the control group with the PCR test as well. Of course, we need to have a large enough sample covering all the different demographies and so on, but then maybe we will be able to do that, right? But so there, but we don't go into the mechanism because that might be too complex. We don't know the mechanism, but if it works, we can use it, right? So that's a very utilitarian view, and utilitarian method of testing. It's somewhat different from testing pharmaceutical drug, because you need to have, there would be some typical explanation of the mechanism, and there would be an active ingredient. So that is one difference. And so in some sense it's similar to the modern scientific method, but there is some dissimilarity as well, which I wanted to highlight. The other thing is, now maybe you can't, whether you can test all the entire body of knowledge in traditional medicine or non-Western medicine, using this kind of methods, right? Using double-blind control trials. I don't think it's possible, because I mean, generally, if you take Ayurveda, for example, so Ayurveda categorizes people with their body types: Vata body type, Pitta body type, Kapha body type, and combinations of those body types. So even if you visit Ayurvedic doctor with the same set of symptoms, I mean, the doctor might give you different treatments, entirely different treatments. It could happen, I think, because you are not treating an abstract disease. You are treating a specific patient most of the time. So in that case, you can't really use this double blind control trials, because the whole idea behind having double blind control trials is you are treating an abstract disease. You are trying to minimize the effect of the subjectivity. You're trying to get rid of the subjectivity by having different samples and having a placebo group and all that, right? So fundamentally that may not be applicable in particularly when treating chronic illnesses. But for something like COVID, and since most of the purported cures or treatments are generic ones, generic herbal formulas, you can certainly do that. But then again, the difference would be you are not going to the mechanism, you are only looking at the output, right? So I think that has some similarity with how you test. The other thing is, I think, now whether you can solely rely on clinical trials, I don't think that's the case, because even if you look at pharmaceutical drugs, many pharmaceutical drugs sometimes get recalled after clinical trials. When they go to the market, there would be like different complaints, and sometimes you would go back and update the treatment protocol based on the feedback of the public. There would be sometimes court cases, litigation, and all that. That has happened quite often in the past. So I think there are two reasons for that. One thing is, when you do the clinical trial, you are only taking samples, right? So samples can never account for all the scenarios that can happen when you give a drug to the public or a vaccine to the public. The other thing is, I mean, the conflicts of interest. So particularly with the pharmaceutical drugs, is the company that is producing the drug or going to profit from the drug that is doing the trial, right? Because it's very expensive. Often it's very impractical to use public money to do that, because there are so many different drugs and so many different vaccines. So I mean, automatically there will be conflict of interest, right? I mean, of course it's in their interest to uh, have a positive outcome for the trial. So you can always play with the samples, you can always play with the numerical methods that are used to derive the efficacy. So I mean, there are so many ways that you can play with the numbers, I guess. So that could be one reason why clinical trials should never be taken as the be all end all. um, there can be so many different so many different variables there. So because of those reasons, even after the clinical trials, when you give it to the public, it is actually a crowdsourced experiment, a participative experiment. It's a bit like testing a software. I mean, how many bugs that you catch in the actual production, or how many bugs that you capture when you release the software, right? Often most of these software, they go through different kinds of testing, beta testing and so on. But there are so many updates in software, because they have found out about a bug only after releasing it to the public, right? So same thing happens with drugs, I think, pharmaceutical drugs. Because things you can't, because there is a uniqueness in every human being, I think, so which you can't eliminate 100% in control trials. So I don't think clinical trials are inherently superior to crowdsourced experiments. You can even argue crowdsourced experiments are superior, because often that catches things that are not caught in the clinical trials. But both have their pros and cons, I think. Yeah. So how does all these relate to neural networks? So I think in neural networks, generally in machine learning, but particularly in neural networks, it's too complex. I mean, when you compare, say, if we have a certain problem like predicting identifying a vehicle in an image, right? Whether there's a vehicle in an image or not, or predicting someone, predicting whether someone is going to pay back a loan or something. So all these complex problems, you use some input parameters to a neural network, and it will go through some hidden layers the neural network I'm talking about artificial neural networks, not actual neural networks in the brain, artificial neural networks which are used in to make predictions. So we use neural networks most of the time. I mean, if you are using a smartphone, chances are you will be using dozens of them throughout the day for checking out weather, when you do Google searches, when you use Facebook, right? When you type a Gmail, email, search key predictions, different kinds of things. So we might be using them throughout the day, even without realizing them. I think even the automatic background light option, where the background light automatically changes in the smartphone, even those are based on neural networks. So it has a huge amount of utility, but it's arguable whether it's strictly science, because of course there are heuristics, there's mathematics involved, there's statistics involved. But when you want to check whether when you want to compare different neural network architectures for the same problem, you can have multiple architectures. When you want to compare across them and try to identify the best architecture for a certain problem, maybe predicting weather, right? It's what you typically do is you would have different architectures based on that differ based on certain heuristics, and you would give a training data set and have a test data set and check which architecture performs best. So it's a very empirical approach. You don't really look at the theoretical correctness of one architecture or the other. That really doesn't matter. What matters is which one gives the lowest error, because in any prediction there will be some error. All you want to do is reduce the error, right? And for a certain problem, one architecture might work better than the other, and nobody knows why. And it's very difficult to explain that why that difference is there, because the neural network itself is a very complex nonlinear function. So you can't really break it down. Of course, there are some attempts to explain how a particular architecture works and all that, but that is secondary. It's not primary to the function of the neural network. If you have a neural network that works, most people would be happy with that, but the courts and legal systems would not be. So that's why in some applications, particularly when the litigation process is involved, people are interested in explaining how neural networks work, right? So I think that has some relevance. That is something somewhat, it's not that similar to how usually science works. In science, I think usually you have you observe certain things and you come up with some abstract theory. So for example, in the theory of gravity or something, maybe Newton observed things falling and he came up with this theory, and there's a mechanism to that, and there's a mathematical function that is derived based on the theory and a mathematical expression. Using that, you can do predictions and you can validate whether those predictions are correspond to the empirical data, empirical evidence, and if it matches close enough, you accept the theory. So that's supposed to be how science is working. But in neural networks, that's not what happens. You don't really worry about the mechanism that much. All you care about, so because you can't really break it down, it's too complex. You have different architectures and you compare, you just look at how they perform, right? And it's a very utility based approach, not a very theoretical approach, right? So, and you try with different architectures. So it's a very trial and error based mechanism. Otherwise, if you had a data set, if you had a problem, you should be able, if it was purely theoretical, you should be able to predict the architecture that works, that suits that particular data set, that particular problem. But that's not how it works. In neural networks, typically there's a lot of trial and error, right? So it's a bit like, I think, testing for these herbal formulas, because you don't worry about the mechanism that much, because maybe it's too complex. Usually that's the case, but you look at the output, right? What works. I think that can be used in many other knowledge systems, or even in traditional medicine or non-Western medicine. Maybe you can use it even to test doctors or Ayurvedic practitioners or herbal traditional doctors. Because you maybe you want to test whether someone is good in treating chronic kidney disease, so you don't really care what they do. I mean, they might be casting spells or doing whatnot. You just look at 100 people who visit that particular person or monitor them over a certain period of time, and maybe you can use biochemical experiments to test whether their kidney function has improved over time. uh, so it's not a very rigorously controlled experiment, but uh, because it's very difficult to have a placebo group in that situation, and then you can see whether there is not noticeable improvement. So it's because we are testing a very subjective knowledge, that knowledge that is encompassed, encapsulated with that particular person. Maybe he's not willing to give it out, maybe he can't really explain it, he just has some traditional formulas or something, and you can maybe compare different practitioners like that, because they are testing a subjective knowledge, um, using a sort of an objective method. So I think that may be applicable. It can be even applicable in a more broader sense to test entire medical systems. You know, I think even in modern medicine, a branch of medicine that is coming up is called precision medicine, where you look at the genetic makeup of a certain person. I think that is increasingly used in treating cancer. Yeah, because certain I think these what do you call these chemotherapy drugs, they don't work well in certain people and they may work with certain other people. So you basically give a targeted medicine, maybe that's very specific to their genetic makeup or something. Now you can't do a double blind trial, I think, with that, but what you can do is you can test that entire method using a group of people. You can't test a specific drug because the drug varies with each person, right? You can test the entire approach. You can give that precision medicine approach to a certain group of people, and you can give a generic drug to another group of people and test whether that entire approach is working. So that's a more abstract kind of way of testing something, testing the method. You're testing the method itself, right? So maybe something like that can be done with traditional medicine, because traditional medicine too, I mean, it has a lot of potential. I think many people they claim to benefit from it, and I think there are problems as well, because since it is very deregulated, it should be deregulated. Otherwise, if you try to deregulate it, you lose a lot of uh, you will lose a lot of knowledge that is there, a lot of utility you will lose. But at the same time, there are people who may not know better. I mean, who may not be harming patients, who may be they may have good intentions, but they may be harming patients. Or there could be like crooks, right? And there could be very genuine. I think there are many genuine herbal traditional doctors and Ayurvedic doctors and all these other other medical systems. They truly want to help people, and they do help people. So whether we can use that kind of use a utilitarian method of using the testing methods in one knowledge system where applicable. It doesn't have to be that way, but where applicable, we might be able to marry those two systems and have something useful. So I think we can take a cue from neural networks, because in neural networks, even though it has huge utility now in most of the real world problems, neural networks perform much better than the theoretical models or statistical models. So it has huge utility, and it is used in modern technology. So it is based on some mathematical principles, but it is not a strictly theoretically grounded field. uh, so we can take a cue from that and use a similar approach, I guess, where applicable, to validate traditional medicine. I don't think it should be imposed, but like I said, where applicable, we can maybe test a particular specific formula, like in the COVID case, because what people propose are generic formulas. If not, we can even go a step further. We can, if a particular traditional doctor is willing, we can validate that particular doctor, right? Whether he's legit, or whether that person is has effective treatment to treat a particular chronic illness, because chronic illnesses are the real issue in the modern society. And we can even go a step further and test the entire method, right? Or the medical system using some kind of a biochemical experiment, like you can do with precision medicine. I don't know how they test, how they have validated precision medicine works. Maybe in the seminal papers they have used such a method where they apply the precision medicine based method and the generic method and compare the two. I suspect that that's what they have done. They may have done. So we can maybe use a similar method in other. We can broaden the applicability of such a method to non-western medical systems. So I'm talking about medicine because that's very relatable for all of us, even people like me who are not from a medical background. But I think it can be applicable, that kind of you know testing the individual, testing the practitioner kind of approach might be applicable even for other knowledge systems that are very subjective, like astrology or psychic, people who claim to have psychic abilities and so on. Because they also, you can't really separate the body of knowledge from the individual, right? It's kind of it's tightly coupled with the individual, their subjective knowledge and the subjective experience. Okay, that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. And do share your comments and thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for connecting, and see you again with a similar video. Thank you.